Okay. So again, we're starting with promises for the next 3 days. Today, tomorrow, and on Monday, we'll be doing promises and working with some asynchronous code. Because again, understanding how asynchronous things work, or how to do asynchronous, how to write asynchronous code, and how to understand asynchronous code is quite important. And promises are much more important in that sense, because promises is the modern way of doing asynchronous stuff in JavaScript. You usually do not write the callback functions anymore. It was pre-2015 era. So now we do whatever was callbacks back then is converted into promises. So usually we have this thing called NPM. And NPM is a website where people publish their JavaScript code, and you can reuse that code in your project, right? So they publish it, you can pull it and use it. And this is if not the biggest, one of the biggest code repositories in the world. There are many hundreds of thousands of packages published here. And pre-2015 era, all of these packages were, well, majority of them were exposing a callback style API. So they were expecting that when you call the function, you specify a callback function and you will do your work in that callback. However, when promises were introduced, that was 2015, promises became the way to do asynchronous stuff. So all these callbacks were converted into promises. We'll do something like that today. I'll write a callback async function and I will convert it into a promise version. So you see how the transition happens. However, we do not do such transitions, and it's not common to do such transitions anymore, because even, for example, Node.js itself, they started many years ago to expose same APIs, like reading the file. It has a couple of options. So you can read your file synchronously. You can read your file asynchronously. However, the first option would be to specify a callback function. And the second option would be to have the promisified version of that. So to use promises. Now, one thing I done.
Talking, high floating.
Okay. Okay. So, so in 2015, as I mentioned, promises were introduced, and the new constructor function called promise was added in the spec itself, so in the language itself. Now, this is a promise constructor. This is a constructor function, as you can see. Our IDE or editor helps us here, Visual Studio Code. It says that the promise is a promise constructor, which means we can use the new keyword on this to create a promise. So promise is a new thing which represents something asynchronous, any asynchronous work. That could be a network request, that could be reading a file, writing a file, I don't know, whatever input and output we have can be represented with promises. So I'm going to create a simple promise, and I'm going to show how we work with promises, and then we will implement another function which uses a callback to do some asynchronous stuff. And then we'll convert that into the promise version. So I'm going to start with the promise variable. And as we know, promise is, as we just have seen, promise is a constructor. It is a constructor, so we can call the new keyword to instantiate a new kind of instance of promise. And this promise and the constructor of the promise receives a function. And this function provides us two methods. The first one is resolve, and the second one is reject. Let me write them down, and I'll explain what they are. Reject. Now, your promise can have basically two kind of major states, or three major states, sorry. So when you initiate the promise, it is in a pending state. So which says basically we're doing some work, right? We don't have a definitive answer whether you have a value or you have an error. So it's in the pending state first. So let's write this way: three states initially pending, and then either resolved or rejected. Hence the names, hence the conventional names of these functions, right? We can name them R or J, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. These are just variable names. However, I like to name my variable names semantically. And of course, the order of the arguments is important. The first one is resolve, the second one is reject, not vice versa. So this is an important thing to remember. Now, the way we can return some kind of value from a promise, we call this function resolve. So resolve and reject are both functions. They accept only one argument. If you provide more arguments, they will be ignored. So what we can say here, we can say if math dot, I don't know, random is less than 0.5, then resolve, right? I'm just trying to come up with an example here. And then I can say else reject 6, or this is an error. So now what we do in our promise, this is a made up code, of course, this is not a real life code. However, I'm just trying to simulate our work I'm trying to show the point here. So what I'm doing here is in this function that we provide to the constructor of the promise, we say if math.random is less than 0.5, if you remember, math.random returns a number from 0 to 1, 1 is exclusive. So if it's less 0.5, then we resolve the promise, right? So from the pending state, we move to the resolve state. Otherwise, if by the chance the value of math random is greater or equal 0.5, we transfer this promise into the rejected state. Okay. So now how do I know that the promise is resolved with a value or it is rejected with some kind of error? Now, this was the promise creation part. There is another part called consuming promises. So now, since we have our promise defined, we somehow need to consume the promise, and that's where we will know our value or our error. So the way to consume the resolved value is to do this: promise.then. Right, and the resolved value, the value which we pass to this function resolve, will be in the argument of the following function: value console.log. The promise was resolved with value. Okay. So now when I save this file, we'll see that the promise was resolved with this value. Now I can make this even more interesting. I can just store the value, random value, and then I can use this random value here. And now, as you can see, our random value was either equal or greater than 0.5. Let me also console log it here, so we can see the random value. Random value is random value. Okay, so as we can see, our random value is greater than 0.5, hence this branch was called. Now, as you can see, our terminal complains, and it says that that an unhandled promise rejection occurred. Why? Because we handled only the successful use case. We did not handle the error case. So we when we consumed the promise with .then, we only kind of handled this part. And this one and the else part, the rejection part, is kind of hanging in the air. So that's why Node.js gives an error and says you have an unhandled promise. Now, the way to handle the exceptions or the rejections in the promise is to use .catch. And the first argument will be the error in our callback function, error, console.error, error occurred. Okay. And it should be an error. And I have a typo here, quick fix. Oh, okay. So now both of the branches are handled. Okay, both the resolution with .then and the rejection with .catch. So now, as we can see in the terminal, the random value is greater than 0.5, and this branch was called, and we received our error in .catch. So again, this is the promise creation part on the top. We created a promise here, and we consumed the promise on the bottom. Now let's see what happens when I console log the promise itself. As you can see, my terminal, this is Node.js behaving smart, and it just says that this is a promise, as we can see here, and shows the resolve value there. Now we can also see the type of promise. It is an object. Okay, so be careful when using the type of with the promise. The way you usually check if the value is a promise, they check if promise has this then, .catch, if that variable holds some promise relative methods. So they usually do it that way. So be aware of using type of with the promise. Okay, fair enough. So every time I say a new value will be kind of returned, and if we resolve it with a value which is less than 0.5, we will be in the .then branch. Otherwise, we'll be in the .catch branch. Now what happens if I do something like this? So let's imagine we're in this branch. We resolve our promise, which means we return our successful value, right? What if we do something like this? Reject hello world. So this basically means we first resolve our promise, but then we change our mind and say, no, you have an error there. So this will not work because whenever the resolve function or the reject function is called, you cannot change the status of your promise. So you set it once, you transition it once from pending into either resolve or rejected, and you cannot then change the status of your promise. So if we do this is the error case, of course, because we're above the 0.5 threshold. Now let's save again and again. And now, as you can see, it's 0.25. So we are in this branch, and both of these functions were executed. However, the reject was ignored because we already invoked the resolve function, and if you invoke another resolve or invoke reject, those calls will be ignored. So let's do maybe a resolve and 20. And as you can see, our random value is 0.24. It's less than 0.5, so we're in this range. However, in the .then, as you can see, the 0.24, the original random value was logged, but and the 20 was not logged because again, this line is ignored. Okay, so that's about creating promises and consuming the promises. Now, in case you want to create a promise in place of like a resolved promise, in case you can do something like this. The promise class or constructor function has a static function, right? It is called promise, no, not processing, but it is called promise.resolve. Now, whatever you pass to this resolve will be available in .then. So if I pass 45 and say value console.log value, we'll see 45. If I pass an array of numbers, I'll see that array of numbers. So whatever you pass here, it doesn't, the data type that does not, that doesn't change anything. So I can also pass make joke, for example, and the object will be passed in .then. Now with promise resolve, you will never, the .catch will never work because this is by definition a resolved promise itself. So you can only do .then on this. There's a similar version called Promise.reject, and it creates a rejected promise. And you can consume the rejected value with .catch, rejected value, and the console.error rejected value. And you can say rejected value. Now, as you can see, if I I didn't provide any kind of input for the reject, which means again we're talking JavaScript, so this is also kind of intuitive. So we receive an undefined, just as with any other function call. If we expect an argument but we do not pass any value, the value of that argument is an undefined. So that's why the rejected value was logged as undefined. And of course, the .then will never work on this because by definition, this is a rejected promise when it is created. Now you might ask, why do we need like promise resolve? Why do we need to create a promise which is already resolved or reject? There are some use cases, right? So whenever you expect to return promise only from your function, you can do this. Instead of returning, let's say we have a function sum, okay? A1 and A2. Now, imagine we have a convention that all our functions return a promise for whatever reason it is. So instead of simply returning A1 plus A2, we can return promise.resolve A1 plus A2. And now the function sum, instead of returning a number or whatever it does, it will return a promise of something. So we can now do this. We can say sum 2 plus 32, whatever, then because we return the promise from the function. So, but let's assign this to a value, promise result in promise. Okay, so we can do this. Now we know that the return value of this function is a promise. And what we can do here, we can say result in a promise .then sum result console.log. The result of the sum is sum result. Okay. And as you can see here, the result of the sum is 34. So we can create functions which return promises, and then we can invoke these functions with whatever arguments we need them to invoke, and the result, and we can store the resulting promise in a variable, or we can simply say sum 232.then, because this .then will be operating on the returned value of the function, and the returned value of the function is a promise, right? So this is like doing promise.resolve 2 plus 32. So this is this code is kind of similar to what we had here, sum 232, because it returns a new promise. Okay, sure. You mean Promise.resolve?
In which cases we should use promise?
That depends on the task. So this is a tool that you should be aware of. One of the examples is that imagine you have a sequence of promises, or you have a sequence of values, and you are converting them into promises. And you want your promises to be resolved sequentially, so one after another, which means that you grab your first promise, do dot then, and then invoke the dot then of the second promise in that then function to have your promises resolved sequentially. Now, your sequence has to start from somewhere. And since you have a number, it's not a promise, you have to convert that number into a promise. And the way you can convert that number into promise could be Promise.resolve. So with Promise.resolve, you will start the chain of these promises, right? And then the upcoming promises will be sequentially kind of invoked in dot then, dot then, dot then, dot then. But since your first element is a number, you cannot do a dot then on a number. So you have to convert it somehow into a promise. You can, of course, do this, but since your task there is to simply convert the number into a promise, you can simplify that with Promise.resolve. So this is one example. You can do that. So a real world-ish example could be you have a list of URLs to a chapter of the book. So each URL points to a paragraph of the book. Now you want to build a page where when you open the page, these paragraphs appear in the sequence, but independently from each other. So if the first paragraph is loaded from the backend, you show that. But you should never show the first part, but you should never show the third paragraph if the second and first one are not shown. So this would be an example of sequentially processing your promises. And you have to somehow convert that URL or string or number into a promise to start chaining your promises after that. So Promise.resolve could be this way. Of course, in the example I brought, that would be the network request function or whatever it is. But again, an example of Promise.resolve would be to start a chain of promises. You can use it for that, or to simply return a result value from your function, or to return a promise from your function. You can say, you can write this like this. Okay, new promise, resolve, right? So you can do this, and then you can say resolve A1 plus A2. However, as you can see, this is much longer and inconvenient, and you can simply say Promise.resolve A1 plus A2. That's it.
About in this case, when we give the random value to the function, so what value in here as well, which value will be given to the result? It will be returned.
Yeah, whatever you give to resolve, whatever value it is, that will be available in the .then consumer.
Basically, it can be any value. So we are given a random value, which are we comparing this?
Yeah.
But we can, for instance, hardcode 0 string, it could be returned.
Yeah. As I was showing in this example, it can be an array, it can be an object, it can be even an error. So you can say new error. You can see new error, and that error will be kind of logged. Okay, so let me clear my terminal, save it. And this is the log. This is the console log working. This is the console log working. Okay, so you can give it an error. You can give whatever you want. The error. Okay, and it will just the error. So so whatever you give to Promise.resolve or in this resolve method, it will not see, it does not care if it's an array, if it's a string, if it's a number, symbol, map, set, error, even errors, right? It's kind of counterintuitive. If you give an error object to your resolve, it will resolve with that error. It's counterintuitive. However, that's how it's just stupid. It expects you to decide what kind of value you are providing in your resolve or reject. If it's an error, you should be aware of that and pass that error in your reject. Okay, so that's also something to be aware of. And also in regards to this reject, whatever you pass it, like you pass the number, a number will be logged. Let me just remove this and clear the terminal and save it again. So it says rejected value 1. You can't do this. 1 itself is not an error object, right? So you would usually expect your errors to be new error or whatever it is, or an instance of this error class. You would expect that. However, again, these methods are stupid. Whatever you provide them, they will either resolve or reject with that value. So it is your task and responsibility to know, to provide correct values to the reject or resolve, whatever it is.
It's giving freedom.
Giving freedom. Yeah, it's giving you the control. However, it's slightly counterintuitive because in this Promise.resolve, if I would pass, if I was new to promises and I would pass an error here, I would expect that it should throw, I should be able to catch this in the catch consumer, but no, it doesn't. It just creates a fixed, it creates a promise where the status of a promise is fixed, it's resolved. So whatever value you provide doesn't matter. Okay, so we have seen that our functions can return promises. Cool. So now we can do something with this, I guess. Now I'm going to leave this function, this promise definition, let's put it this way. And now I'm going to define a task for you, which is create a function which receives only one argument, which is a number in seconds, s. Your function should wait for the given number of seconds and then resolve with undefined. Okay, so what I'm looking from you is to create something called sleep, right? A function called sleep, and you will be specifying a number, the only argument, like you say sleep for 5 seconds, and then you should be able to do .then on that, and you should console log the value, and this should logs undefined. So this is what you should be creating. Now I'm putting a note here. The numeric argument should be positive, right? And less than 20 seconds. Otherwise, reject the promise with an error message. Invalid argument. So I feel like I should go ahead and implement this instead of leaving this as a homework. You will have some other similar tasks for the homework. But I think I should go ahead and implement this sleep function myself to just show how it works. Now I'm going to do this two ways with the new promise, and I'll also use the Promise.reject there to show a practical example where you could use Promise.reject. So let's start with the again. Always we start with a problem statement. Okay. So what it says is create a function, not a variable, not a number. It says create a function which receives only one argument. Okay, so create a function which receives one argument, which is a number in seconds. That's why I named the argument seconds. Your function should wait for the given number of seconds and then resolve with undefined. Okay. So the numeric argument should be positive and less than 20 seconds. Otherwise, reject the promise with an error message invalid argument. We can create a resolved promise with Promise.resolve and rejected promise with Promise.reject. And we should use, this is simply a hint, okay? It doesn't say use this. But now line 22 says you should be using set timeout. Okay, so set timeout is the way we will be doing all these awaits. So let's maybe start with set timeout. Why not? So set timeout this is a simple task enough, right? So I start with a set timeout, I return an undefined explicitly, and then in the second argument, I say seconds, right? Because that's how the set timeout works. Unless it does not work that way, because it expects milliseconds, and we have seconds in the problem statement. So I should be multiplying this with 1,000, and I guess this works. No, 1 second is 1,000 milliseconds, not vice versa. So, and I guess this works, right? So we have a set timeout, and we have our milliseconds correct, and then we return undefined, and this should work, right? So let's do sleep 2 seconds and dot then value and console.log value, and yeah, and then I think they should work, unless it does not. It does not, because now we're trying to do a dot then on something which is not a promise, okay? But the problem statement says we should resolve in that function with undefined. Resolve means basically we should be returning a promise. So okay, so maybe return a promise.resolve, but how do I do the waiting here? That's why we have the new promise syntax. So again, since we identified that we should have a function which receives an argument and only one argument, which is a seconds, we now know, and I had an example for you which said sleep 2, and it had a dot then, and it had a dot catch. So this should communicate to you that when calling, then when invoking the function sleep, it should return a promise. Okay, so let's maybe start with returning promise first. Why not? So return your promise, not promise rejection, but promise. Okay, now we know that our promise receives a function resolve, and reject. Okay. So what I recommended was to start maybe with the validation. So why not? Let's maybe start with that. If seconds is less than 0 or seconds is greater than equal to 20, we should reject with the error message invalid argument. Okay. That's fair enough. We start with the validation. If our seconds is a negative number or second is greater than 20, we should reject. So I'll go here, say catch error, and I'll say console.error and error. Okay, now I say 21, and we can see that the error was returned, so this works correctly. Okay, so how should we do the waiting? Again, I had a hint for you on line 22 that you should be using set timeout. Okay, so let's maybe start writing the set timeout itself. The way set timeout works, it receives a callback function and it receives milliseconds as the second argument. So we start with the callback function, then we move to the to the other argument, which is in milliseconds. Hence, we multiply seconds with 1,000 to get milliseconds. And when does this function get called? When does this callback function get called or invoked? You are talking, but I'm not hearing you. Please talk louder. I don't understand what you're saying. No, what I was asking, imagine you have a normal set timeout. You have nothing else. How this works? When will this be called?
When it starts looking.
Yes.
When the timer finishes. Okay. So we know how the set timeout works, which means that the first argument of set timeout, which is a callback function, will be called only when the timer is up, when the time is up. So which means that somehow we should resolve, I guess, or tell the promise that it is resolved in this callback. And how do I say the promise that you are resolved? Here. How do I tell the promise?
Return promise.resolved.
No. You do not return promise.resolved. Correct. I call the resolve function. And of course, it expects to pass. What did I say? We should resolve with undefined. Okay. So in 2 seconds, my value will be resolved. Now, if I would return whatever number it is, it would be resolved in 2 seconds. Now, if I pass 5, it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I counted faster. Okay. So what we're doing here, this works. We've seen it works. However, this can be slightly improved on the file. Okay. Now, what we're doing in our new promise, we're creating a whole new promise and then doing the argument validation. However, if you recall that recording that I sent you a few days ago, what I was saying there, you should return in your functions as soon as possible. And the specific case I brought was validating some values, etc. So in this case, you have a validation in place, right? So you are validating your input arguments. So you should have thought first, how should I return? Is that a question online? Please mute yourself if you are not asking a question. Thanks. So you should think of a way to return as soon as possible. Now, again, we have a validation. This validation has nothing to do with resolving or rejecting. I mean, it doesn't have to do with awaiting, right? So this is just an argument validation. So we can move this part somewhere to the top. Here, we can say if seconds is less than 0 or second is greater or equal to than 20. Now, how do I return a rejected promise? How do I create a rejected promise? Promise.reject.
Return new promise.reject.
Promise.reject. So this could be a use case for the promise.reject. Now, as you can see, we now implemented the idea that you should return in your functions as soon as possible. Now, in the very first lines, I do the validation of the argument, which doesn't have to do with awaiting or waiting for this second, doesn't have to do anything with that, right? So with our validation here as soon as possible. And here we use promise.reject. This way we kind of guarantee that either way a promise will be returned from our function. Hence we can do the dot catch. If I would say 59, this still works because we return promise both in both branches. So we've simplified this definition. We saved a level of indentation, right? So as you remember in that video, I was saying every time you add curly braces, that adds a new level of indentation. So we have saved that level of indentation there. Now we never use this reject function in here, which we can remove. And this will be your solution, right? So we have our function sleep, we have the validation in place. If the argument is outside of the range, we return a rejected promise, which we can consume with .catch. If we otherwise we return a new promise where we do all the weighting, etc., and return and resolve our promise with undefined. So this is how basically creating promise with an asynchronous job works. Okay, so you should be using this result. So you will be doing some asynchronous jobs, and whenever that asynchronous job is finished, you call your resolve, your reject. That's when your promise will return a value in .then or .catch.
If you hadn't written for us as a hint about the amount, how could we guess about?
What was the function that you have learned that you could do some weighting or etc.? What is the web API that you have learned a couple of days ago?
Why should we? How could we come to the idea that we should wait?
Because that should be natural to come to that idea. Because the problem statement says you receive seconds, you wait for that amount of seconds in your function, and then you resolve it. Now, is there any function that you know where you receive milliseconds, you wait for such amount of milliseconds, and then do something? So you should have, crossed the parallels there and came to the idea of the timeout, but I had the hint for you. So even if you did not, but you should have, I had the hint for you that you should be using set timeout.
I'm sorry, but just can we try to write this solution like that having if instead of this if like greater 0 and like less than 20, and not returning first the error, but returning the positive case, like returning the value undefined if it's resolved, and in other case to return.
Why do you want to do that?
Just for practice.
Can you not do that on your own?
Yeah, I can.
Code?
Okay.
I don't see
But I
don't see what that
understand.
teaches me.
I remember it from last classes that we were like looking the negative cases, throwing the out of our solution, then in else returning this like what is positive or results in this case. So just I want to understand like it's good practice to solve the spec to give the solutions in this way instead of like the other.
I don't understand the question, but what we have done here is we have checked for the kind of edge cases or the out of bound cases for the seconds, right? So of course, if seconds is greater than equal to 0 and seconds is less than 20, that's when we should do this.
Yeah.
However, that's the main thing, right? So we are, how do I put this? So when you're validating now seconds is an incoming value, it's an argument. Now, usually you don't say, if the value of my argument is correct, do this job. You can do that. However, usually what you say, you start with check if the value of my argument is correct. If it is not, just exit as soon as possible. And now when you handle all these cases, so case 1, my value is incorrect. Case 2, my argument is incorrect. Case 3, my argument is outside of some kind of range. Now, when your argument passes through all these guards, right, then you have the guarantee that here you have the correct value and you can do the work with that. Now, we can, of course, go ahead and do the otherwise, which will look like this. If seconds is greater than equal to 0 and seconds is less than 20, return this. And then otherwise, if the value is incorrect, return Promise.reject error. Now, of course, you can do this, but the case where your argument is valid, that's when you basically do your job. And usually that can be a lot of lines of code. So we would have to do lots of things in this if, and you would have to nest the whole job in your if, right? So now, and you would have one more level of indentation here, and you could have like 50 lines of code in your if. You can do that. But a better approach is to take care of the negative cases first, and then you will have your correct value, and you will not have your main job kind of indented into your ifs, whatever it is. So again, we saved one more level of indentation here. So the rule of thumb is you do the validation, you do or the kind of argument error handling, whatever you do first, right? So you kind of take care of the negative cases first, and then go do your job with this argument. So that's why we write it this way.
Can we return in the result something else not undefined, but something else?
You can. However, the problem statement was that you should resolve it.
Just for storage.
Yes, you can return, for example, you can return your seconds. And I can say in milliseconds. So this will resolve with 3000. We can do this. You can return here whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. So it will be resolved with this string. So whatever your problem statement is, you will be resolving or rejecting with that. In this case, the problem statement was that you should resolve with undefined.
In real life, it should be
For me,
the response. Or
Depends on your problems. What is the response? Is that the HTTP request response? Yes, in that case, yes. However, in that case, in such cases, you will not be writing such promises because a function like fetch or cy.request will already return promise-like objects, so you don't have to do this. But, we're doing that here for you to learn how promises work. Yes.
Is there a way to check this function by giving seconds from outside the world or somehow in the function? Because I saw you are giving some value to resolve function inside this new promise. And just imagine if this is a real test case and you should give an argument. Can I check somehow, like my example also? I want to check my function, but I don't know how to give the seconds from outside.
Here is how you give your seconds from outside the world. It's an argument of your function. That's how you give it. That's how it is.
I mean a real number to give, for example, 30 seconds and to see how the function works.
I don't understand the question. Let me see your messages, please.
Not this one, the last one, the last.
This talk, please, the last one.
Yeah, like my question is, this is a function which we are going to use in real life, like in one of the test cases, and we should call this function like giving some milliseconds, right? Like if we call this function, we will give the number in place of waiting seconds. Is it possible to check it here with this code only, not calling from other, I don't know, class or something, which is like a real test case? This is just one function, right? Which we are going to use in some checkings of, like as a QA engineer, to check a test case, to see is it waiting for 20 seconds or not. We should at the end give some waiting seconds to this, in my case, return promise. How to check it here when you don't have that main, I mean, from which the real test case is going to work? I think I'm...
Lijan, in your example, you got it wrong because you are assigning new promise to this variable, but the task was, your task was to create a function, not to create a promise, and then create a function inside the promise. So the task was to create a function and to return a promise from that function. And when you create your function, this is how you will get your values from the outside world. You will have arguments. And your functions which have arguments can be called like this. So that's how you will receive 36. That's how you will receive 23. This is how functions work. So that's how you will be passing your values into your functions from the outside world to the functions. The code here is completely reversed. So
I see. Okay.
Any other questions?
If you want to pass arguments, we should use to create first functions and then inside the promise. And when do we need to create a promise separated?
What does it mean to create the promise separately?
First promise equal new promise.
That's usually not super helpful. If you would like to, to play around with promises, you can do that. However, promises are usually not created that way, like new promise and then do dot then whatever it is, because usually you return promises from functions and then do something on top of that.
So it's a usual and normal way to use this promises.
This is the way to use promises. Yeah, however, again, as I mentioned, you usually do not create promises by yourself because whatever asynchronous stuff you usually try to do, they already return promises, okay? So whenever you want to make a network request, you don't write your network request in a new promise. There is usually a function which returns a promise to you, and you will be working on that. However, I'm trying to show how promises work, what promises are. I'm not saying that for any of your tasks, you will be creating a promise like this. However, know that this is how you create a promise. And the specific function, actually, I've used this function a lot myself in my projects because sometimes you need to wait for something because continuing to do something else. So I've created a function like this in my own project, right? Like a small function, which I use. I call sleep here and there, and then I do some waiting before doing something else. So this is actually something that is used in the real world. Hence, I brought this example. Okay.
Function, does it wait you talk about the database, does it wait for the response to be returned?
What does it mean? Does it wait for the...
Does it sleep until the response is returned? Or it sleep like some quantity of milliseconds?
I don't think I understand the question. This is the amount it sleeps or waits for.
Yeah, but is there a way to wait until the For example, why I'm asking this because this is the most use case for us that we will using. I know that as I don't request tenants.
Anyway.
Ways where the response is received and after it goes on. But in these cases, there are way to wait. We have learned that one response until one request is returning the response, the code stack continues working, so the other code continues working, and as soon as it is resolved, so if
Le արդյուն չենք ասել։
Մասն ճանապարհ կա request անել ու սպասել մինչև այդ request-ի response-ը կա, նոր շարունակել հաջորդ request անել, այսինքն հաջորդ կայլը կամ կոդը շարունակել, բացի այդ time-out-ից, որովհետև այդ time-out-ը մենակ վարքյաններով կա, հիվի վարքյաններով կա, այս promise-ները օգտագործել են։ Okay.
So the question, the specific question was regarding doing some HTTP request with side.request. So I've created a small function to kind of simulate the fetch method, which is available both in browsers and Node.js, starting, I think, last year or something like that. So the question was, how do we fetch something, and when we get the response of that thing, fetch another thing? So how do we make the second fetch to wait for the first one to complete? So let's say URL console, or let's just resolve it with the URL. Okay. Now, this is a simulation of the original fetch. Of course, we're not going to do any HTTP requests here. However, I'm trying to show you the point here. So the way you would do this in the browser or Node.js, you would write fetch and you would say HTTPS, whatever it is, example.com, whatever. Now, fetch returns a promise. Of course, in real life, that promise can also return an error. So we can start with .then, right? So the normal case, and we'll have the response. We can, for example, console.log our response. By the way, great question, because I was going to get to my last point, and I will do on the example that you asked. So nice question. Yeah, let's for example console log the response and maybe use something in this response to make the second fetch. Okay, like this. So let's construct the URL like the following: users, and I'll be grabbing the user ID from my response, if that makes sense. .body.id, whatever it is, we don't care. So now what this means is that we make the fetch for we'll make the first fetch, which is a GET request. Let's imagine it's a GET request. We're not trying to complicate things. So GET request, GET request. So what we've done. So what I've done on this line 44, I initiated the HTTP request. Now I know that this fetch returns a promise. And I know that the promise has .then, it's the consumer for these success cases. And I have another consumer, which is .catch, where I will expect to receive error response. And I'll simply console.error response. Okay. So I'm just doing that. Now, when I mean this then, that means I already received my response from the backend. And the task is to make the second request when the response has come. So that is when I will do the second fetch. Okay. However, now we are getting to the point where we can write another then, response console.log response. Okay. Now I'm not going to ask what is the value because you don't know that. So I'm just going to explain. So we have the first 10. This first 10 is going to work when we successfully receive a response from example.com. Now this is invoked. We'll get our response from example.com, we console log it, then we invoke the fetch method again to fetch the user with this ID. We do not return anything explicitly, which means what will be returned from this function?
Response of the second. Fine.
Undefined, correct. Now, again, this is a function. We do not return, we don't have the return keyword, which means we implicitly return undefined. Now, what we will have in this second then, the response will be undefined. Okay, so you can pass values from one then to another and chain these thens together. Hence, it is so powerful to work with promises because you can return one value from the then and instead of nesting, instead of doing this, okay, instead of doing this and nesting your then and nesting the then calls, can you see how this is similar with that pyramid of doom, the nesting? So if I have the third, let's imagine I have the third network call, right? It would be another fetch, hello, and I would have to have another dot return. And as you can see, I'm continuing to nest. So we came to the same pyramid of doom. However, promises were created specifically to solve this issue. And now this is the way you solve this issue. Now what you do in your first then, instead of returning an undefined, you return your second fetch. And the way this then is going to work, it is going to await for this then to resolve. And then it will work this. Now, the way this catch works, in any case, whether this first fetch, whether the second fetch, whether you have a syntax error anywhere in your code here in these lines, if there is any error between these lines, you will be able to catch it here. That's why it is always recommended to have the dot catch as the last part of your dot thens, dot whatevers, to have your dot catch as the last consumer, so you can catch all kind of errors there are. Yeah, so this is the way you'll do it. So this will be second response. Okay. Now, as you can see, when I return the promise from this then, in the second then, I will receive the result value of the second promise. And this is how you escape that pyramid of doom with callbacks, with thens. So this is a normal way to use promises. So this is what I actually wanted to also show as the last point of today's session. Yeah, chaining dot then calls to avoid pyramid of doom. So did this answer the question or? Okay. This is how you really use that, how you really use promises. You do not do this, right? You just don't do this because you will continue nesting your promises, your dot thens, and you will have the exact same problem that you have with callbacks. With callbacks, you cannot escape this. It's impossible. With the promises, you can either escape this by just returning your promises and using another dot then to consume that new value, or you can again go ahead and have a pyramid of doom, but you will just neglect the value of promise there. Oh, you must have gotten one. Okay. And this is how you would actually use promises in real life.
So these are chainables. This is chainable.
This is
What does it mean, chainable?
chainable means that you can say dot then, dot then, dot then, dot catch, dot then, dot whatever. You can just chain those. Okay, makes sense. You can say promise, promise dot then dot then, and then at the end say dot catch. So this is the chaining process.
This first dot then is fetch is changed from fetch.
So the first dot then works on the result of this function call, which is the first promise. And then we'll return another promise in the first dot then. And the second dot then works on the second promise returned by the second fetch. And this dot catch will catch any errors, whether it's here, it's here. If you have a syntax error, well, the syntax error will not be catched, of course, because it's not a runtime error, but the syntax error. But if you have a runtime error, that will be also catched and put in this error response. So, did that answer the question? Okay. Okay, I don't think I have anything more to show right now. I've divided these promises into a few days. We'll learn some more static promise functions tomorrow, some very useful ones. I don't know if you will be using them in your Cypress repository, though I have seen a few of them used. So that's why I'll be teaching these methods tomorrow. Any questions?
Once again, what is called consuming? What does it mean consume? Just what consuming what is used for?
Now, here we have a function called fetch, which returns a promise. Now we create the promise here. Sorry. When we call this function fetch with an argument, we basically return a promise, which means we create a promise. Now, when you create a promise, when you do something like this, Promise.resolve 1. Now, this promise by itself, we don't have anything else. Is by itself is simply a useless thing. Yeah, it is a promise, but how do you see the value of the promise? How do you get that one in the promise? Okay, so you created a promise, but you never seen the value of the promise. I mean, the one that is there. Now, how do you get that value? That's when you consume your promise, but with .then. .then again receives a function, a callback function, right? Now, the argument of that function is the resolved value of your promise. That's the .then, and we can do console.log value. And if I bring this up, we will see 1. So again, if I comment this out, we will see nothing. Nothing happens. Yeah, we created the promise. It's like, imagine we create a function hello. Now, what this function does? Nothing. Even if we say console.log hello. Does it console.log hello? No, you have to invoke the function somehow, right? So you should say hello, and that's when your function gets executed. It's kind of similar with promises. Yeah, you can create a promise, but it does pretty much nothing until you consume it. Okay, so yeah, .then, .catch. There is also .finally, which we'll talk about tomorrow. So again, if we would do fetch example.com, of course, this would create the promise, and this would still do the HTTP request and get the value. But if you would not have the .then, there would be no way to see the value, to see the response. So yeah, you would make the HTTP request, but it would be useless because there is, you never said, I want to use the value of this promise. So .then and .catch are these ways, the consumers of the promises. Again, similar to functions, you can create a function, but if you do not invoke your function, that function does nothing. Okay? You have to invoke your function for it to do whatever it does. Again, similar with promises, you can make the HTTP request, you can say Promise.resolve 1, just that. But if you do that, yeah, the promise is created, but if you do not consume your promise, which is you do with .then and .catch, you will not have access to the value of the promise. Any other questions?
So here, when you printed one for the promise and hello for the function, as in case of set timeout, hello was printed first, and only after that the promise callback. Yes.
Can you please repeat the question? I didn't hear it fully.
Yeah, here you was console logging the value of the fetch, yes, which is our promise, and hello for the function. And as in case of set timeout, the hello was printed sooner than the console log for the fetch request.
Yeah, that's correct. For with set timeout, the hello will be logged sooner than whatever we have in set timeout. So what is the question?
Լավ հայրեն էլի ես ասեմ, այսինքն նույնը եղավ նաև այս վերևի գրած fetch-ի ժամանակ, fetch-ում որ մեկը էր տպում, մեկը ավելի ուշ էր, քան hello-ն էլի որ տպվեց։
So let's do something like this. Let's create a promise, promise.resolve one, and we say dot then and value, and I say console.log. The value of the promise is value. And then I say console.log hello. Now, promises are asynchronous in JavaScript, similar to set timeout, whatever it is. Promises have their own queue. It's called a micro task queue. We'll not go into the details what that is. It's kind of similar thing to the web API queue and the callback queue, but they have their own dedicated queue. So we have the call stack, we have web APIs, we have callback queue, and imagine under the callback queue or above, there is another queue called micro task queue, specifically for promises. Now, when I save this console.log hello will be logged first, and promise.resolve, even since we immediately get on line 40, we immediately get a resolved promise, and we think that the dot then would be kind of immediately logging the value of the promise. However, that's not the case because we have a micro task queue, and the callback function will be scheduled in that micro task queue, and whenever the call stack is empty, that's when we'll be putting our callback function of this then in the call stack, and we'll see that logged. So I just saved the file, and as you can see, hello is called first. However, in the code, it is the last statement. It's the last function call. So we have hello console logged first, and only then we have our console log the value of the promise is 1. So promises are always asynchronous. Okay. As I explained in the beginning, promises are the modern way of handling asynchronous stuff in JavaScript. They are always asynchronous. Even if you get a resolved promise or reject promise in the very beginning, and you say dot then, you might kind of expect that this is a resolved promise. There is nothing to wait for. There is no waits, no request calls, nothing to just wait. So we have our value 1 resolved in the promise, and we're just doing dot then. So maybe we should get it logged first. However, that's not the case because promises are asynchronous, and we would have to empty our call stack first, do the synchronous code first, and then grab this callback function from the micro task queue and execute that.